The day I caught my wife cheating was the same day I learned I was unemployed, though frankly the first discovery stung more than the second. She wasn't even creative about it. No dim hotel, no secret hideaway. Just my own couch. My couch, bought with my paycheck, where she sprawled out with my so-called best friend like they were auditioning for a commercial called Ruining His Life in HD. She didn't scream when I walked in. She didn't cry or scramble for excuses. She just looked up, cool as ever, and asked if I could give them a minute. Imagine being downgraded in your own living room to an unwanted extra. I stood there wondering if I should clap, maybe offer them refreshments, when my phone buzzed with the email. We regret to inform you that your services are no longer required. Perfect timing. Fired and cuckolded simultaneously. Talk about efficiency. My best friend, the man I once trusted with my secrets, had apparently been busy convincing the board that I was unstable, right around the same time he was convincing my wife that fidelity was optional. He stole my job, stole my wife, and somehow thought I'd just crawl away. I didn't. I laughed. Because if life insists on turning me into a punchline, then I might as well become the comedian who burns the whole stage down. I should have known long before the Couch Olympics. Looking back, the signs were practically neon billboards. She stopped laughing at my jokes. Granted, they weren't all winners, but I used to get at least a polite chuckle. Then there was the perfume that didn't belong to her and yet lingered on her clothes. "Oh, it's a sample from the mall," she said. "Right. Because department store clerks just spray you down like you're a mosquito." She started coming home late, always with the excuse of networking. Networking, it turned out, was just her networking horizontally with my best friend. Even the dog didn't wag his tail at her anymore, and that mutt has better instincts than I ever did. Meals changed too. She used to cook with care, even if the result was barely edible. Suddenly it was takeout every night, bags of food arriving with receipts I wasn't allowed to see. I didn't ask, because some part of me was terrified of the answer. It wasn't that I trusted her. It was that I didn't want confirmation I had married someone who could smile at me with my best friend's cologne still clinging to her skin. Then came the late-night phone calls she tried to take in the bathroom, whispering as though the tiles were loyal allies. One night she forgot to mute, and I caught, "Don't worry, he'll lose his job soon." That should have been the alarm bell, but I convinced myself maybe she was talking about someone else. Someone else indeed. Meanwhile, my best friend started avoiding me like I was contagious. No more poker nights, no more bro talk. Just quick nods and awkward excuses. He even stopped borrowing my lawnmower, which, frankly, was the only blessing in the whole mess. Still, I kept going to work like a good little soldier, convinced that my marriage was simply in a rough patch. Except this rough patch had razor wire and landmines. The final straw came at a dinner party. She poured wine for him before me, smiled in a way she hadn't smiled at me in years, and laughed at his terrible jokes like he was the reincarnation of Richard Pryor. When I called her out on it later, she shrugged and said I was imagining things. Gaslighting at its finest. Apparently, my eyes were broken. By the time I was fired, the whole puzzle snapped together. My so-called best friend had been whispering in the board's ear, painting me as unstable, reckless, a liability. And guess who handed him all the insider details on my work schedule? The woman who still had the audacity to wear our wedding ring while undoing her blouse for him. I should have exploded, but instead I found myself weirdly calm. Maybe betrayal is easier to swallow when it's served so shamelessly. I realized then that loyalty was a one-man sport in my house. She chose betrayal over loyalty, and he chose ambition over friendship. But me? I chose to bide my time. If they thought I was just going to disappear quietly, they didn't know me at all. You see, my wife always had a weakness for signing things without reading them. Credit cards, gym memberships, timeshares in Florida she never visited. She loved putting her name on things, thought it made her look important. That weakness would become my weapon. As she paraded around on his arm, bragging about their bright future, I started watching. I noticed how sloppy they were, how arrogant. They thought no one was paying attention, least of all me. But I was. Every late-night whisper, every sudden business trip, every unexplained deposit in her account. Each detail was another nail in their coffin. I kept quiet, nodding, smiling, pretending to be the loser they imagined. All the while, I was sharpening the blade. And when the time came, I'd make sure it wasn't just revenge. It would be justice, gift wrapped in her own handwriting. I started laying the trap the way a bored carpenter might start on a chair, quietly, with patience, and an eye for the weak joints. First, I stopped pretending everything was normal. I used the one advantage I still had, the small, boring things no one noticed anymore. Their arrogance was a commodity. They spent it lavishly and left receipts. I remembered how my old office kept paper trails for everything because corporations love paperwork, the way magpies love shiny things. So I went back to places I knew. The vendor lists, the expense reports, the little memos that circulated like office gossip. I didn't need to be clever, just attentive. Their signature habits stuck out like tattoos, late-night wire transfers with vague memos, invoices from shell companies with names that sounded like bad startups, expense accounts suddenly ballooning around the same weeks they booked romantic weekends. I made a list. Names, dates, amounts, small things assembled into a pattern. Then, I pulled a few loose threads. A vendor listed as consulting turned out to be a landscaping outfit with a P.O. box in another state. A purported conference in Miami had a registration fee but no conference. My best friend's company had a habit of paying contractors who never showed up. None of this screamed felony when looked at individually. Stacked together, they hummed like a warning siren. I hired someone competent. Not the smoky-eyed private eye from bad movies, but a practical ex-analyst I knew from the firm who had been quietly pushed out years before. He had a way of reading spreadsheets like other men read novels. He smiled when I handed over the list and said, "Looks messy." That was the kind of understatement I liked. We didn't break into anything. We didn't forge or fabricate. We requested documents, interviewed quiet vendors who suddenly remembered missed invoices, pulled archived emails where my friend used corporate addresses to make personal promises. I fed everything to the analyst, and he turned it into a neat, ugly picture. A web of transfers, offshore accounts with ambiguous owners, and contracts with my wife's name signed like a flourish you make when you don't bother to read the fine print. That last part angered me far more than the affair. She loved signing things because it made her feel official. She had been signing authorization forms and addendums that allowed money to move and permissions to be granted without asking questions. Her handwriting became the visible thread tying her to the mess. I took the file to someone who could do something with it, a lawyer I'd helped years ago during a corporate dispute. He squinted at the pages, folded the top corner, and said, "We can send this to the regulator. They'll want a complaint." I didn't want to be the one to speak. Anonymity is a decent cloak when you're dealing with people who still own other people's favors. So we let the lawyer draft it, we attached the documents, and we let the machinery of accountability start its slow, bureaucratic crawl. The first letter came back like a small victory. An acknowledgement, polite and non-committal, but it meant someone had read it. Then the calls started. Quiet inquiries, auditors requesting clarification, auditors who did not appreciate being treated like a joke. My friend and his partner squared their shoulders like men who expected the world to bend to their will. My wife reacted like she always did when confronted. Small panic at first, then that practiced serenity, then anger thin as tissue. She blamed paperwork she signed on a whim, said she'd been manipulated into approving things while distracted, claimed she'd been naive. She cried without wetting her cheeks, a performance I had seen before in smaller acts, a refund request, a canceled subscription. But the auditors found signatures that matched her purchases, dates that coincided with her nights out, wire transfers that ended at accounts with names that sounded like addresses she used for deliveries. It wasn't instant. It was procedural, the kind of slow, patient unspooling that makes hubris nervous. Investigators asked for interviews. The friend lied, the way men do when they believe their own cleverness, but lies have a hard time surviving paper. He tried to explain away invoices as marketing, as consulting, as creative accounting. My wife tried to distance herself, to say she had trusted him. Trust is a thin shawl when the weather turns criminal. The more they squirmed, the cleaner the trail looked. In the end, it wasn't a single smoking gun so much as 1,000 tiny smoldering matches. By the time the regulator stamped a notice and the bank froze assets, they were already invested in their narrative of innocence. They had their fingers in the machinery and forgot that machines leave fingerprints. My part was surgical. Gather, hand off, watch. I did not dance in the courtroom or crow in the papers. I watched them panic, then watched the panic turn to paper. Subpoenas, seizure notices, charges. And as the net closed, I felt something I'd expected would be crude and ugly, instead fold into a sharp, inevitable clarity. I had not taken a life or broken the law. I had simply put their actions where the law could see them. Their empire, built on swagger and shortcuts, began to show the first cracks. They thought they could bluff their way through, the way they bluffed dinner parties and anniversaries. My wife still strutted around like the queen of a collapsing kingdom, waving her handbags as proof of immortality, while my ex-best friend rehearsed speeches about market fluctuations to anyone willing to listen. But the regulators didn't care about designer shoes or clever sound bites. They cared about numbers, signatures, and whether money had been siphoned from investors who suddenly wanted blood. I didn't need to lift a finger anymore. Momentum had its own appetite. They started getting questions they couldn't charm their way out of. Who authorized this transfer? Why did this contractor never show up? Why is this account tied to a shell company registered at the same address as your beach house? Every answer they gave contradicted the last. And there, stamped neatly at the bottom of those forms, was my wife's signature, looping and proud, like a child drawing crowns on every piece of paper. She didn't realize each crown was a noose. I would sit at cafes, sipping bitter coffee, reading little news blurbs about ongoing investigations and potential fraud. I had never savored caffeine so much. Meanwhile, she tried to keep up appearances. She dragged herself to galas, plastered smiles over whispered rumors, and hissed at me when we crossed paths. You're pathetic. You'll never move on. The irony was delicious. She was the one drowning, yet she insisted I was the dead weight. I let her think it, because nothing is more satisfying than watching arrogance walk willingly into its own trap. The house changed too. Creditors called, envelopes piled up, and the once endless deliveries of shopping bags dried to a trickle. She started selling jewelry, one piece at a time, under the guise of donating to charity. I watched her peel herself down like an onion, each layer revealing how fragile her empire truly was. My ex-friend was no better. He bragged for months that he could lawyer up and shut down any investigation. Then one day his attorney quit, citing irreconcilable differences. Translation: the money was running out and no one wanted to drown beside him. That was when panic replaced smugness. They turned on each other like rats in a flooded basement. She blamed him for manipulating her into signing documents. He accused her of being greedy and stupid. Their whispers leaked into the wrong ears, and soon enough, the prosecutors had everything they needed. Two conspirators tearing each other apart while standing on a mountain of evidence. I never raised my voice. I never threw a punch. I never begged her to come back. I had already lost her long before the couch scene. What she forgot was that I also stopped caring. What mattered now was the elegance of the trap. Each time she accused me of being a failure, I bit my tongue and waited, because I knew she would soon be measured not by wealth or charm, but by her inmate number. I still remember the day she stormed into the kitchen, eyes red, yelling that someone had leaked the files. She jabbed a finger at me, shrieking about betrayal, about how I'd ruined her life. I leaned against the counter, calm as a monk, and asked, "Which life? The one you lived with me, or the one you lived with him?" She hated that answer. She hated that I wasn't angry anymore, that I didn't even care enough to shout. But that's the thing about revenge. It doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it's just silence, paperwork, and the sound of handcuffs clicking shut in the distance. And with every passing day, that sound grew closer, echoing through her designer halls, rattling inside her champagne glasses, until the only question left was not if she would fall, but how hard the landing would be. The day it all cracked open wasn't announced with trumpets. It started with a knock at the door, not the gentle, neighborly kind, This one rattled the frame, heavy and certain. She answered with her usual blend of irritation and arrogance, wearing silk pajamas like armor, already rehearsing some dismissive quip. Instead, she found 3 federal agents standing on the porch, suits crisp, badges catching the morning light. I was in the kitchen with my coffee, watching through the reflection in the microwave, and for the first time in years, I felt my heart rate slow rather than spike. They asked for her by name, the way you might ask for someone on a reservation list. She blinked, laughed, and told them they had the wrong house. They didn't laugh back. They had papers, stacks of them, bearing her signature, her initials, her flourishes that once made her feel important. She turned pale, then red, then pale again, like a traffic light that couldn't decide. I sat at the table, stirring my cup, listening to her sputter about misunderstandings, while one of the agents calmly read charges aloud: wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering. Each word landed like a hammer. My ex-best friend wasn't spared either. They caught him at his office, dragging him out past stunned employees who suddenly remembered every shady thing they'd ever seen him do. I got to watch the footage on the evening news. His face was contorted, halfway between rage and fear, and I thought, there it is, the real him, finally unmasked. Meanwhile, she tried to spin the story. At first, she claimed victimhood. I was manipulated. I trusted him. I didn't know. But investigators aren't fools, and documents aren't sentimental. They had dates, times, transaction records. Her name popped up everywhere. She wasn't a bystander. She was a participant. She signed things she shouldn't have, approved transfers, and benefited from the flow of stolen money. The image of her dripping in jewelry, laughing at parties, was damning all on its own. The prosecutors painted her not as a clueless spouse, but as a willing accomplice. Her lawyer tried everything: delays, motions, pleas for sympathy. None of it stuck. She had spent too many years being careless, arrogant, and loud. People remembered her boasts, her bragging about smart investments and connections at the top. Every socialite she'd ever flexed on suddenly turned into a witness with a story. One by one, the walls closed in. Watching from the sidelines was surreal. I wasn't gloating, well, maybe a little, but mostly I was fascinated by how quickly an empire rots when the foundation is nothing but lies. One month she was shopping in Paris, the next she was sitting in depositions, makeup running, trying to explain why her initials appeared on accounts in the Cayman Islands. I didn't have to lift a finger anymore. The machine rolled forward without me. Still, I savored the little ironies. The handbag she once waved in my face got seized as evidence of purchased with illicit funds. The luxury car she flaunted on Instagram was repossessed in front of neighbors who filmed it gleefully. Even the dog refused to climb into her lap, preferring the quiet corner where I read my paper. She was losing not just money, but the illusion of control. Court hearings became a parade of humiliation. She arrived in expensive outfits, hoping to signal power, but the judge didn't care about labels. He cared about facts, and the facts were ugly. I watched her eyes dart around the courtroom, searching for sympathy, but all she found were cold stares. Investors who had been duped sat in the back rows, arms folded, eager to see her fall. My ex-friend sat beside her, shackled by his own greed, no longer the golden boy. They whispered frantically, blaming each other, pointing fingers like kids caught cheating on a test. And me? I sat there quietly, present but invisible, the ghost of the man they'd underestimated. I didn't testify. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. When the prosecution rested, the silence was suffocating. The jury looked at her with a mixture of disdain and boredom, the way people look at a rerun of a show they once liked but now find unbearable. She tried one last performance on the stand, voice quivering, eyes glistening, talking about love, trust, betrayal. Funny how she suddenly understood those words when they suited her. But even her tears seemed counterfeit, like diamonds bought in a back alley. The gavel finally fell, sealing her fate. Guilty on multiple counts. My ex-best friend got his share too, but what mattered was the sight of her. My wife, the woman who had laughed at me, dismissed me, replaced me, standing frozen as the verdict echoed through the courtroom. I half expected her to collapse, but she stayed rigid, as though pride was the last thread keeping her upright. The bailiff approached with handcuffs. I leaned back, folded my arms, and thought, "There's the jewelry you can't pawn off." As they led her away, she turned once, eyes locking on mine, and for the first time she didn't look superior. She looked small. In that moment I didn't feel pity or rage, just a strange, calm clarity. She had traded loyalty for betrayal, chosen arrogance over humility, and now she was paying in the only currency left, her freedom. They led her out of the courtroom in cuffs, and for the first time since the day I walked in on her with my so-called best friend, the world felt balanced. Not healed, not redeemed, just balanced, like a scale finally settling after years of being tilted. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, and she tried to turn her face away. But orange jumpsuits aren't designed for privacy. Her lawyer muttered about appeals, about misunderstandings, but no one cared. The headlines were too good. Glamorous socialite turned white-collar criminal. She was a story now, a cautionary tale, the punchline to a joke she once told at my expense. I didn't cheer. I didn't clap. I just went home and poured myself a drink, not out of celebration, but because silence tastes better with bourbon. The empire she'd bragged about, the cars, the house, the endless shopping bags, was gone. Seized, frozen, or auctioned. The friends who once orbited her like satellites scattered the second the money evaporated. Even her family kept their distance, claiming they'd had concerns for years. She sat in a cell, waiting for sentencing, and I sat in my kitchen, waiting for the phone call that would tell me it was final. I didn't have to wait long. The judge gave her a healthy stretch behind bars, enough years to strip the smugness from her voice. My ex-best friend got his own set of years, though slightly fewer since he cooperated at the end, throwing her under the bus like it was a team sport. Ironic, really. They'd united against me, but loyalty between thieves lasts about as long as champagne at a wedding. Watching them crumble wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about exposure. They'd built their lives on illusions, love, friendship, wealth, and I'd been the fool who believed. Now the world saw them as they truly were, liars in designer clothes. She tried writing me letters at first, rambling apologies, excuses, half-baked pleas for sympathy. She wrote about loneliness, about betrayal, about how she'd been led astray. I didn't answer. I didn't even read most of them. I stacked them in a drawer like unpaid bills, proof that even in prison she couldn't take responsibility. Eventually, the letters stopped, and that silence was sweeter than any apology. People asked me if I felt vindicated. Some wanted me to gloat, to post about justice served. But I didn't. Because vengeance isn't fireworks. It's the quiet knowledge that the person who tried to bury you is now buried by their own shovel. I walked past our old haunts sometimes. The restaurant where she once toasted to our bright future. The boutique she drained my account for. The office where my best friend stabbed me in the back. They looked smaller now, like sets left behind after the actors moved on. The humiliation she once tried to pin on me had boomeranged, and the world wasn't laughing at me anymore. They were laughing at her, at them, at the empire of arrogance that collapsed faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. What I felt wasn't joy, but freedom. The kind of freedom that comes when you finally stop trying to fix something rotten. I'd been fired, betrayed, humiliated, but I hadn't been destroyed. She, on the other hand, went from mansions to metal bars, from champagne to cafeteria trays, from diamonds to chains. That was her journey, her masterpiece of self-sabotage. My role was simply to make sure the truth saw daylight. And daylight, unlike her lies, doesn't need polishing. When sentencing day arrived, I didn't even go to court. I sat on my porch with the dog at my feet, coffee in hand, and let the sun warm my face. Somewhere across town, a gavel sealed her fate, and the world kept turning. I didn't need to witness it. I'd already seen enough. My vengeance had been merciless, yes, but it was also quiet, methodical, almost boring, and maybe that's what made it so satisfying. She had chosen betrayal over loyalty. I had chosen patience over rage. And in the end, patience proved the sharper weapon. When the gates finally closed behind her, I didn't feel the rush of triumph people imagine. There was no orchestra swelling, no dramatic applause, just a deep, steady quiet. I walked through the house that used to echo with her footsteps, now stripped bare of her perfume, her sharp laughter, her endless demands. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was clean. I found myself enjoying the little things again. Brewing coffee without wondering if she'd sneer at the brand. Reading a book without the TV blaring reality shows in the background. Even folding laundry felt like an act of defiance. Clothes that were mine, worn by me, not props for someone else's performance. News trickled in from time to time. She had tried to run the same games inside prison. Alliances, manipulation, playing queen in a world that didn't care. But prison is the great equalizer. Without handbags and boardrooms, she was just another number. Her empire rotted the way fruit does in the sun, fast and irreversible. And me? I rebuilt, not in grand cinematic ways, but in steady, stubborn steps. I picked up freelance work, odd contracts, things that reminded me I still had value. I reconnected with friends who had slipped away when the scandal broke, people who wanted nothing but my company, not my wallet or my name. For the first time in years, I slept without clenching my jaw. I'd been chained by betrayal, but the chains had fallen off the moment hers clicked shut. That's the real twist no one talks about. Sometimes you don't win by fighting louder, but by letting the truth dismantle the lies for you. She had chosen to gamble everything: marriage, friendship, wealth, thinking she could outsmart everyone. What she underestimated was how patient I could be, how silence could cut sharper than rage. I didn't destroy her. She did. I just made sure the world noticed. If there's a lesson buried in all this, it's that loyalty is priceless until it's broken. Once shattered, it can't be glued back with apologies or gifts. Betrayal has a way of stripping people bare, showing them as they truly are. She thought she was untouchable, but the law doesn't care about diamonds or charm. It cares about ink, signatures, paper trails. And she left plenty. I won't pretend I didn't savor her downfall. I did. But the satisfaction didn't come from seeing her kneel in chains. It came from realizing I didn't have to kneel anymore. I had been jobless, humiliated, discarded. Now I was free. She had her empire, her best friend, her illusions. Now she has bars, routines, and regret. That's balance enough for me. So here I sit, coffee steaming, dogs snoring at my feet, and I ask myself the question she never did. What really matters when the show is over? Not the mansion, not the clothes, not the titles. What matters is walking through your life without the weight of lies on your back. She chose betrayal. I chose patience. And patience, in the end, gave me peace.